thank you to all of you who are spending this evening with us. I am so excited to talk to you about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. And as Shannon mentioned, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. Shannon will either answer them in the Q&A or she will hold them and give them to me at the end of the presentation so that I can answer your questions live. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen here. There we go. This is your introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. What you should expect is a presentation for beginners, for people who are not familiar with our work or want to get a refresher with our work, okay? I am not going to go into enormous detail on every single aspect of every single thing we do because one, this is supposed to be an introduction, and two, I don't want to presume to know what aspect of our work you're most interested in. That's what the Q&A session is for. And so if there is something you want to know a little bit more about or something that you felt we breezed over, please do remember to ask a question about it. All right. In a nutshell, what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find non-voting environmentalists, and then we turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means, though, is that we don't do a lot of the stuff that many other environmental groups do focus their attention on. So, for instance, we don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse candidates. We don't even, as weird as this might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment. In fact, a good way to think about us is we're not even in the mind changing or opinion changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior changing business. What we want to do at EVP is bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is changing people's opinions, and instead find the people who no longer need their opinions changed. Find the people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority, yet they're not voting, which means those people are ripe for what is purely a behavioral intervention. And I know this might sound like a narrow niche, and it is very focused, but for better or for worse, it's not as narrow a niche as you might think. There are a lot of these non-voting environmentalists out there, and it's a very high leverage way for those of us in the climate movement to start dramatically increasing our political power. All right, so why do we have this particular focus? Well, because one of the biggest problems we face in the climate movement today is that far, far too few voters list climate as a top priority. What you're looking at here is exit polling data from 4 years ago, so from the 2020 presidential election. Out of the 160 million people who voted in the 2020 presidential election, only 4% listed climate as their top priority. Now, fast forward 4 years to the election we just had a few months ago, it went up a little bit. 7% of voters listed climate as their top priority. And we should feel a little bit better about that. But we still need to look at that number and understand that that is nowhere close to where we need it to be. I'm going to assume that all of you understand the enormity of the climate and environmental crises we face right now. And with a crisis, with a set of crises so large, to have so few voters list climate as their top priority is a real, real problem. Here's why it's a problem. First, when so few voters list climate or other environmental issues as their top priority, boy, is it hard to elect true climate leaders. The second reason, even when we get lucky, even when we do elect good climate leaders, though, when only 4 or 7% of voters list climate as their top priority, well, what's the likelihood that that great environmental leader we just elected is actually going to follow through on those priorities? It's pretty darn small, right? I mean, we all know that just because the so-called right person wins an election doesn't mean they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done. No, they still need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on, and they ain't going to spend it on the thing that only 7% of voters list as their top priority. And I realize these are just two sets of exit polls, but I promise you, if you look at midterm elections, if you look at local elections anywhere from Alaska to the Florida Keys, and you poll people who are voting in those elections, you will always see one thing very clearly, and that is that far, far too few voters list climate as their top priority. And this is a reality that those of us in the climate movement must confront. The simple truth is that we do not have enough political power, period. No politician is scared of us. No politician feels that they can win on a mandate of climate leadership. And it comes back to numbers like this. And the third thing that I want to bring up about why this problem, why this lack of climate voters is so problematic is this. Whether you vote or not is public record. Say that again because it's so important. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. That might not seem like a big deal, but it is. Because if you are running a campaign, your only goal is to get 50% plus one of the votes on a Tuesday in November. And if you literally know by name and street address all of the people who have a record of showing up in the election you're trying to win, well, who do you think that campaign's going to target? Likely voters. And if they're only going to target likely voters, or mostly going to target likely voters, who do you think those campaigns are going to poll? Again, likely voters. And the non-voters, the people who skip local or midterm or even presidential elections, they get ignored. And I know that sounds cynical, but come on. Like, politicians are in the business of collecting votes, not non-votes. Why on earth, if you're trying to win an election, should a politician spend all their time trying to convince non-voters to like them? Especially when they literally have a list by name and street address of all the people who have a history of showing up in elections like the one that they're trying to win. And this is really bad news for those of us who care about climate and the environment. Because when you look at polls like this or this, where so few voters of the people who actually show up list climate as their top priority, man, like, it is going to take a miracle for politicians to spend real political capital leading on climate. And I'm sorry, we can't depend on miracles. Instead, what we need to do is build political power, serious political power as quickly as possible. All right, I promise you, this isn't going to be all doom and gloom. But like any nonprofit, we're in the problem-solving business. That's what good nonprofits hopefully do. And so I wanted to start off by defining the problem that we are trying to solve. What we are trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project is the fact that there are far, far too few voters who prioritize climate and the environment. And that makes it really, really hard to ever get any political movement on climate and environmental issues. But now let's get to the solution. Because the more we looked at this issue, and this led to me starting the Environmental Voter Project, we realized something really strange was going on here. We realized that the reason so few voters list climate and the environment as their top priority is not because too few Americans do. So even though politicians, as we see on this slide, focus on people who are likely to vote most of the time, if you broaden your aperture, if you step back and you look at a broader section of the population, maybe say all registered voters or all eligible voters, well, it turns out that huge numbers of them care deeply about climate and the environment. So what's going on here? Why do so few voters list climate as their top priority when so many Americans care deeply about it? Well, for one pretty simple reason. Environmentalists aren't voting. One of the key pieces of information that led to me starting the Environmental Voter Project was that it became very clear that the climate and environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. And there are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't vote. And as frustrating as that is, and believe me, it frustrates me, frustrates all of us sometimes, it's also an opportunity because we live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, but especially climate and environmental issues. Yet all of these non-voting environmentalists represent a huge population of people who don't need their minds changed. They are already with us. They just need their behavior nudged. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But it is easier. And it's also cheaper and testable, as we will show you over the coming minutes. But before I get into those solutions, before I get into what we do, how we do it, and some of our results, I realize I just made a big assertion. I just said, like, there are millions of environmentalists who don't vote. So let's get into the data. Let's get into some of the numbers here so that we can move on from the problem to the solution and then to some of our results. When we look at the election that just happened, when we were going into it, we identified over 10 million registered voters who listed climate or the environment as their top priority, yet were unlikely to vote. Over 10 million. If you go back to the 22 midterms, we estimate that 13 million super environmentalists did not vote. 13 million. You don't need me to tell you that we live in an era of frustratingly, achingly close elections. And there are more than 10 million already registered super environmentalists who aren't voting in these big federal elections. And as you can probably imagine, in local elections, these numbers are even higher. I'll give you another data point. We are starting to have voter files updated in a few of our states. We work in 19 states at the Environmental Voter Project. In 6 of them, voter files have been updated. And we can see who voted and who didn't vote in last November's election. Because remember what I said earlier, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And so what we can do is we can look at turnout of all registered voters in a state and compare that to all the environmentalists we identified and their turnout rates. And what you see here are those comparisons for all 6 of the states that we have data for so far. And look at that. And every single one of them, people who list climate and the environment as their top priority, voted at a lower rate than the overall electorate in that state. So it wasn't just that climate and environmentalists weren't really good voters. They were all below average in every single one of the 6 states for which we have data already. Now, I want to be clear. Some of these numbers might be a little different from what you've been seeing for turnout numbers. That's because we are listing turnout percentages of registered voters, not eligible voters. We do that for a few reasons. One, in most states, just because you're eligible doesn't mean that you can vote. You do need to register. And two, at the Environmental Voter Project, we only mobilize registered non-voting environmentalists. And so because that's the only thing we have data for, we wanted to make apples to apples comparisons here. But just to give you a sense here, yeah, in some states the numbers are pretty close. Kansas, maybe it's 2 percentage points. Nebraska, maybe 2 percentage points. But in some states, you'll see it's getting even bigger. A little bit bigger in Arizona, much bigger, 5 percentage point difference in North Carolina. Holy moly, look at Louisiana. And let's just take North Carolina for a second here. Let's say that instead of climate and environmentalists, uh, climate voters and environmental voters voting less than the overall electorate, less than the average of their state, they just matched it. Let's just say that they were at 72.7, they were equal to the average turnout in that state. That would have meant another 45,000 climate first voters casting their ballot in North Carolina. 45,000. Now, that wouldn't have been enough to have changed the outcome this year in North Carolina, but that's a huge, huge number in a very, very important state. A huge, huge number. I'm going to move on from this slide, but stay tuned. We are going to have 19 states worth of data to illustrate stuff like this. But I did just want to go into a little bit of detail here because when we say, hey, environmentalists aren't voting, people are often hungry for some data. And this is the kind of stuff that we are seeing. The climate movement is not voting, and the environmental movement is not voting. And what this means is we are leaving an enormous amount of latent political power on the sidelines. An enormous amount. And by the way, all of these differences are statistically significant. Every single one of them. All right. So this is the problem we face. This is the problem we're trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. The fact that there are all of these people who don't need to be persuaded to care about climate and the environment who aren't voting, even in the highest turnout elections like presidential general elections. So what do we decide to do? We want to go and get them. We want to identify them and mobilize them. So how do we do that? Well, it's a 4-step process. Identification, mobilization, habit reinforcement, and then ultimately changing the electorate. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the first 2 of these 4 things over the next few slides. But just know, like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to go into excruciating detail on any of these. This is an introductory webinar. It's not meant to be a deep dive into particular things. If you end up wanting more information on these, we're going to supply links in the chat, and you can always show up to different webinars that go into that detail. All right. For now, though, let's breeze through these. Step 1, identification. What we do is we work with data scientists to build predictive models that allow us to individually identify people in each state who have a very, very high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their #1 priority over all other issues. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to go into some more detail on this. But for now, for the next few minutes, let's just leave that step 1 there. We build predictive models that enable us to individually identify people who are likely to list climate as their top priority. And then we can just look at their voting histories and weed out the ones who are good voters, right? We don't need to waste our time and money mobilizing people who are already going to vote. So we just focus on the ones who don't vote. That lets us go to step 2, mobilization. And now we have this great opportunity in front of us because now we can make a purely behavioral intervention. We don't need to persuade these people to care about climate or the environment. They're already there. No, we just need to turn these people into better voters. And so what we do is we run hundreds of experiments each year called randomized control trials that help us isolate which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to do one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to start voting. We work with thousands of volunteers to canvass and call and postcard these voters, all with this proven messaging from our randomized control trials. And then we as a staff also run direct mail and digital ad campaigns, always with this optimized messaging. We have now run hundreds of experiments. And so we have the luxury of being able to tell all of you, if you are volunteering for the Environmental Voter Project, you are always being given a message that has been proven to work in a previous randomized control trial, a message that has been proven to increase turnout. Okay, that brings us to step 3, habit reinforcement. We truly work year-round, as many of you know, because it is the January after a presidential election, and here we are having an introduction webinar. What you might not know, though, is that we've actually been active in 7, maybe 8 different elections since November, since the presidential election. We will likely be active in over 200 different elections in 2025, a year when most groups are taking time off from voter contact. And why do we do this? Why are we involved in literally hundreds of elections in an odd year? Because you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that the way to build good voting habits is not to parachute in every 2 years and talk to voters. No, you need to take advantage of every single opportunity you've got to turn non-voters into new voters, into consistent voters. So we truly view every election as a behavioral intervention opportunity. Even library trustee races, even little local ballot measures, dog catcher races, fire district elections. I mean it. I freely admit that many of these elections I just mentioned have nothing to do with environmental policy making, but you better believe they've got everything to do with building good voting habits. Now, I promise you, not all of the elections we're active in 2025 are going to be fire district commissioner elections. Most of them are going to be state legislative races or mayoral elections or special congressional races or big statewide races. There are going to be some very big statewide races this year, but some of them will seem inconsequential, but they're not, because this is how you build consistent voters. And we have the data to prove it, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But ultimately, remember, we want to get to step 4, and that is changing the electorate. Ultimately, our goal is to build such a large block of consistent climate voters that politicians have no choice but to lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but rather because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Politicians go where the votes are. And so it's incumbent upon us to make sure there are as many climate voters as humanly possible, whether we're talking about a midterm election or a presidential or a city council race in Omaha, Nebraska, which happens to be coming up in like 2.5 months, and we're already getting ready for it. All right. I told you I was going to go into a little bit more detail on steps 1 and step 2. So I'm going to do that right now. Then I'm going to get to our results, get to some opportunities in the upcoming weeks for you to get involved, and then we'll have our Q&A session. So, identification. How do we identify all of these non-voting environmentalists? Well, I mentioned in the last slide that we work with data scientists to build predictive models. And in a nutshell, this is what this process looks like. And actually, before I get started, I should say this. What I'm about to describe is the same way that presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns and other sophisticated political operations now identify voters. It's through building these predictive models. And this is how it works. First, we survey huge numbers of people, literally tens of thousands of people. These are not dinky little 500-person polls. They are enormous. But we can get away with it cost-wise because we're only asking one question. We're saying, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's take Pennsylvania as an example. Let's say we poll 10,000 people in Pennsylvania and 1,000 of them or 800 of them list climate or the environment as their top priority. Well, then we can find these 800 people on public voter files and start figuring out, okay, what do we know about them? What do we know about these 800 Pennsylvanians who just self-identified as listing climate as their number one priority? What voter file data do we have on them? What census data? What publicly available behavioral or consumer data? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there, and it's really, really helpful in learning about all of these environmentalists. And perhaps even more importantly, it's really helpful when trying to find other people like them. Because that's what we do. We start looking at these 800 people and trying to figure out little patterns and correlations in all this data that we have on them. And maybe we start to see some trends. Maybe we'll see that agriculture and forestry employees are 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as their top priority. Or maybe people with no home, a new home and no kids are 6 times as likely. Maybe basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, or football fans. There are a lot of different data points that have predictive power, and none of them are predictive on their own. But when you put a whole bunch of them together, boy, does that end up being a really powerful and precise way to start finding other Pennsylvanians beyond those 800 who self-identified, who are likely to list climate as their top priority. And maybe we start seeing things like, oh, if you're a Latina grandmother who recently bought a Volvo and lives in the Philly suburbs, you have a 92% chance of listing climate as your top priority. Or maybe if you are a black man in his 20s who just graduated from college or in your first job, you have a 79% likelihood of listing. There are a lot of different clusters of these likely environmentalists. And we test and retest and retest and retest until we get a really accurate read on every single Pennsylvanian in that state voter file. And what we literally do is we assign a score from 0 to 100 to each one of them, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their top priority. What you're looking at here is a score distribution of every single voter in Pennsylvania, every single registered voter. And as you can see, many of them, millions, have like a 30% or less likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. That shouldn't surprise anybody, right? We know that there aren't tons of voters who list climate as their top priority. And then there are a whole bunch of people here in the middle we can't really be sure about. Remember, this is a probabilistic model. So if someone has a 50% chance of listing climate as their top priority, they also have a 50% chance of not listing climate as their top priority. But then look, way, way up here, this is what we pay attention to at EVP. There are still close to 1 million people who have a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their number one priority over all other issues. And these people have individualized scores assigned to them in the voter file. And so we can see who they are. And I know this sounds like a long, convoluted process, but these models are frighteningly accurate. Because at the end of the day, when we isolate those people who have a really, really high probability of listing climate as their top priority, remember what the next step is. We look at their public voting histories. We get rid of the ones who are already likely to vote. And at EVP, we only concentrate on the ones who need to have better voting habits. And just to give you an example of what we found this last fall, is there were 42,067 registered voters in the Philadelphia city limits who were registered to vote, had a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their number one priority over all other issues. Yet we could see from their public voting histories that they did not vote in the 2020 election or any election since then. And so, yeah, they were unlikely to vote. These were our targets. Not to be creepy about this, but like, we literally know them all by name and street address. We have phone numbers for them. This is not broad demographic targeting. This is individualized targeting, where we know to ring the buzzer of Josephine, who lives on the second floor of the walk-up, because she's the one we want to talk to, and not our roommates or the people on the first or the third floor. This is individualized targeting that has been shown to be extraordinarily precise. When we find these people, as I mentioned, we then mobilize them, working with thousands of volunteers to do door-to-door canvassing, phone calls, volunteer postcards. We, as a staff, run direct mail and digital ad campaigns. And I won't get too much into the messaging. If you're interested in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about that. But one thing that I'll just say is, through these hundreds of experiments, we have come to realize, and I use we in the broadest sense, there are also lots of academics and other behavioral scientists who do a lot of work on this, and they've come to realize as well that, oddly enough, the best way to get a non-voting environmentalist to start voting is not to talk to them about climate change or the environment. In fact, we don't even try to rationally convince them of the value of voting at all, which I know sounds weird. Instead, we treat people as social beings rather than rational beings. We're not trying to convince them of the importance of voting. Instead, we're trying to find out, who are they? How do they like to think about themselves? How do they like to be viewed by others? And how can we use that to make them more likely to vote? Human beings are social animals. And boy, is it hard to rationally convince someone of the value of their one vote over a denominator of millions. But if instead you speak to them as a social animal and you say, hey, did you know that, like, last time there was one of these elections, all of your neighbors voted? In fact, we literally know that 137 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote. Boy, is that more powerful. And yeah, it's peer pressure. It's juvenile peer pressure, like you would have heard on the third grade playground, but it works. It works. We also show up to people's doors, ask them if they intend to vote. Most people will be embarrassed and they'll say yes. And then we follow up with them right before the election, remind them of that promise to vote, and equate the act of voting with whether they're an honest person who keeps their promises. Is that a little aggressive? Yeah. It also works. And boy, do we lean into stuff that works, even if it is a little aggressive. Because you know what else is aggressive? The democracy crisis. You know what else is aggressive? The climate crisis. We aren't playing games here. We need to build up the climate movement's political power, and we have found ways to identify non-voting environmentalists and then use messaging like this and many other experiments to get them to start voting. All right. I'm going to get into some more details in the Q&A if you're interested in learning about this. Maybe in the chat, we can also share some links to webinars that we've held before on successful voter turnout messaging, and even We're very open with our experiments. We had a webinar once with all of our unsuccessful experiments. We want to share that with people. We're very, very open about which messages work and don't work. All right. Let's get to our results here, okay? The first way that we measure our results is in specific elections. And the way we do that is through something called randomized control trials. This is also, by the way, how we figure out which messages work and don't work. Very briefly, the way randomized control trials work is, let's use Pennsylvania as an example again, okay? Let's say we've identified 300,000 unlikely to vote Pennsylvanians, okay? What we do not do at the Environmental Voter Project is immediately start messaging to all 300,000 of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. One is called a control group, and the other is called a treatment group, or sometimes it's called an intervention group. Now, the control group, we never talk to. Never. This slide makes it seem like it's an even number between treatment and control. Usually the control group is about 15% of the non-voting environmentalists we've identified. So that control group, 15% of 300,000, so what, 45,000, we set them aside and we never talk to them. Then the remaining 85%, that's the treatment group. These are the people who get our interventions, canvassed and called and mailed and sent digital ads, all with this optimized, proven messaging. Then the election happens. But remember what I've now said quite a few times. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And so a few months after the election, we can start seeing who actually voted and who didn't vote, not just in our treatment group of the people we were contacting, but also in our control group, the randomly set aside unlikely to vote environmentalists. And what this process enables us to do is isolate what our sole impact is on turnout while controlling for all outside variables, because we can compare turnout in our treatment group to turnout in our control group. And whatever that difference is, as long as it's what statisticians call statistically significant, and those are the only results that we report are statistically significant results, this enables us to isolate our sole impact on turnout. Because let's say it was raining in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout. Well, there's the same percentage of Pittsburgh residents in our control group as in our treatment group. We controlled for that variable. Or let's say the Harris campaign spent $1 billion mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania. Well, we controlled for that too. Unless they hacked into our system and decided to only target people in our treatment group, but nobody in our control group, well, we controlled for that variable. Because chances are they were contacting and mobilizing people in our treatment group just like in our control group. And so this enables us to isolate what our sole impact is on turnout. We're not like many groups who say, hey, we contacted 1 million people and half of them ended up voting. Aren't we awesome? We created 500,000 votes. No, we all know that that's not a precise way to measure your impact. You want to know, and believe me, we do too, what our sole impact was on turnout. We want to know whether we actually made a difference or whether we should just pack up and go home. And in the 3 years leading up to 2024, and we'll be releasing last year's results shortly, we could see in randomized control trials that we got statistically significant results in 2020, 21, 22, and 23. Increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. Those might not sound like big numbers to some of you, but they are everything in politics. Everything. Well, I want to be clear. It isn't like we increased turnout among all Pennsylvanians 1.8 percentage points. We're only targeting the non-voting environmentalists. But remember those numbers that I showed you earlier. There are tens of millions of these non-voting environmentalists. In Georgia, just this past fall, we were targeting almost 600,000 voters. We increased turnout 1 percentage point. That means we're solely responsible for getting 6,000 climate first voters to show up in a swing state who otherwise would have stayed at home. That's enormously powerful. And we have the receipts. We publish all of these results on our website, and we can include the link in the chat. So this is the first way that we measure our impact in specific elections. We also want to measure our impact over the long term. To give you a sense of where we work, just this past year, actually, you know what, before we get into the long term, I'm going to do a little bit more short-term stuff. Just this past year, we communicated with 3.9 million unique voters across the 19 states where we work. And you can see on this map where we currently work. All of those targets, as a reminder, were registered to vote, highly likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority, yet unlikely to vote in last fall's election. We only have updated data for a few states. We hope to have updated vote history data to see which of our targets voted and which didn't in all 19 states, maybe in about 7 or 8 weeks. But what we do know, what we do have data for in all 19 states is how many of those 3.9 million ended up voting early. Over 710,000 of them, including huge numbers in many states. Now, I want to be clear. We are not saying that we were responsible for getting 108,000 first-time climate voters to vote in Florida. We communicated with them and they ended up voting for the first time. But we run these randomized control trials so that we can let you know what we're solely responsible for. But this gives you an idea of how many first-time climate voters we were pulling off the sidelines this last fall. In a place like Nevada, just the ones who voted early heading into Election Day were over 27,000, which is larger than the margin of victory in the Senate race in Nevada. So those are really, really big numbers. All right. We measure our long-term cumulative impact. This is the second way we measure our results in a different way. Whenever we communicate with a voter, we tag them in our voter file and we follow them. And we keep on communicating with them if we think they are unlikely to vote in a particular election. But what we really like is when we get to a point where we no longer have to talk to that voter because they've become such a consistent voter that they don't need a group like us anymore. Well, as of about 10 months ago, because this is the last time we measured this, and we're going to measure it again in about 6 weeks, EVP had communicated with over 10.5 million unique individual voters, all of whom, by definition, were really unlikely to vote and really likely to list climate as their top priority. Well, as of the time of this measurement, we saw in these people's public voting histories that over 1.8 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. You could be running for city council and you would look at the voter file and you'd say, oh, that person's going to vote. Got to go talk to them. Tell them about my campaign and maybe figure out what issues they care about. We helped put all of them there. Now, I want to be clear. This metric, this long-term metric, is different from the first one, the randomized control trial. Unlike the randomized control trial, I can't claim that we at EVP are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. No other organization is coming up on their 2000th election over just 9 years. That's how many elections we've been involved in. I believe it's 1,996 elections since we launched. This is the type of year-round habit-building work that grows a voting bloc and has you go from 4% of climate voters in 2020 to 7% to more, to more, to more. All right, I want to leave time for the Q&A, so I'm going to breeze through the rest. We've been getting a lot of great attention for our cutting-edge work using data science and behavioral science like this. These are just a few of the outlets who have featured us, who have given features to our work. We're very, very proud of everything that we're doing. Maybe many of you saw us on ABC News a few months ago as well. We're very, very proud of this coverage. But what we're even more excited about is our work in 2025. And you are here because you care about this. You are here because you want to make a difference. And my guess is that, like me, many of you were tired, many of you were scared, many of you are angry that you still have to campaign, that there's still so many important things to fight for, but you're here. And we're grateful you're here, and we want to give you some opportunities to make a difference. Because we are working every day to mobilize voters. The polls literally closed about an hour and a half ago in Virginia, where we were mobilizing voters for 2 special elections there. Every day we're mobilizing voters. So how can you make a difference? Well, first, let me say that if you get involved with the Environmental Voter Project as a volunteer or as a donor, this is what you can expect. First, brutal honesty. We don't care about looking effective. We care about being effective. We always test our work. We are always putting randomized control trials on our mobilizations so we can see if we have made a difference. We are not doing what feels good. We are doing what works. 2, we are always building political power. You might not be ready yet to get back in the game, but I promise you, when you are ready, whether it's next week or next month, we will be here ready to onboard you and get you going. Because 3, we truly respect our volunteers and donors. We know that you are here to make a difference. And so we take it very seriously to show you that you're making a difference. At the end of all of these webinars, at the end of phone banks and canvassing and postcards, we let you know what all of your numbers are. We let you know what the data is. We let you know what your impact was. Just in the next 5-6 weeks, we are going to be mobilizing hopefully over 40,000 voters for the 2 special congressional elections in Florida. We are also going to be mobilizing voters in Black Hawk County, Iowa for their county supervisor. It's like their county executive election, a very important election. There are 2 state Senate district special elections coming up in Louisiana. And then believe me, we get into some really big and important elections in March and April. But right now, you can sign up to be part of these phone banking opportunities, to mobilize voters with proven scripts. So before we get to the Q&A, I want to encourage you to get involved. This is what you can expect from us. Since the presidential election ended in November, we got right back to work. We've already, I think, called over 75,000 voters since the presidential election to mobilize for elections. We're running digital ad campaigns as well. We've also been researching possible expansion states. You saw that map of the 19 states that we're active in. Well, we might be announcing an expansion soon. We are also building brand new voter targeting models, those predictive models I told you about. We want to update them to make sure they are as precise as possible. We also, by the end of the month, are going to be announcing our first postcarding campaign, and we're going to be relaunching door-to-door canvassing. And then, yes, as more and more states release updated voter files to show who voted last November, we are going to be releasing our randomized control trial results from the second half of last year. But already on our website are the results from the first half of last year. It's up there. If you want, you could probably spend a day on our results tab going through all of the reports and studies that we put up. We want to be very, very transparent with all of these results because we're proud of them. We want you to be proud of them too. So I encourage you, get back in the game. First, we would love for you to become a monthly donor. Might not surprise you that a lot of people aren't donating to voter mobilization campaigns the January after a presidential election. And so in January and February and March, we rely almost solely on our monthly recurring donors. There will be a link in the chat. Please click that link and sign up for a recurring donation. It can be $5 a month, $10 a month. It could also be $5,000 a month. The sky's the limit. But every little bit helps. 2, sign up for phone banks. There's a link in the chat. You can sign up. Every single phone bank starts with a training. There is someone there to hold your hand and answer your questions. None of the voters will see your phone number. They will only see our phone number, and you will be getting proven scripts. You can get back in the game right now. And finally, stay tuned for canvassing and postcarding opportunities. We will be making announcements to everybody on our email list, but you'll also be able to find them on our Get Involved page, which is where the phone banks are. So I am really, really excited to get to the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think we've got about 10 minutes left for some questions. So Shannon, what do we got?
Yeah, Charlotte asked a great question of how do we decide which states we're in or like when we're considering expansion?
Great, great question, Charlotte. So first, let me, just in case people have forgotten, let me show you the states that we work in. Can you see that, Shannon? Is that showing? Awesome. So these are the 19 states that we currently work in. Why these 19 states? Well, these are the criteria it takes for us to work in a state. First, a huge number of non-voting environmentalists. We need to have lots of targets. If there aren't lots of non-voting environmentalists in a state, it kind of doesn't matter how good we are at this. We're still not going to make a difference and change policymaking. So you might notice we don't work in states like Wisconsin or Montana. That's not because they're not politically important. It's because there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. If you care about those states, I'd rather you get involved with another organization who can have a bigger impact than we can. But if we are working in a state, one thing you know is we've identified a whole bunch of voter targets there. Second criteria, we want to work in states that don't just have elections in even years, they also have elections in odd years. Because although we're very clever with our tested messaging, the truth is repetition is really powerful. And sometimes just talking to people over a lot of elections is just as good or even better than having really clever messaging. And there are some states that only have elections in even years. And so not only do we work on states that have lots of non-voting environmentalists, we also want states that have lots of elections every year so we get multiple bites at the apple. The third and final criteria, we don't just care about federal policymaking. We also care about state and local policymaking. Not just because of the political environment that we're in right now, but because no matter what the federal government looks like, the state government usually controls electricity grids and utilities and building codes. Local governments control zoning and other important bylaws and traffic bylaws. There are a lot of really important environmental and climate opportunities that flow out of state and local policymaking. And so, yeah, we want to be in New York State because they've got a mayoral election coming up in a few months. And that's a really, really big opportunity for climate leadership. Or we want to be in a Nebraska, not because we think it's a battleground state for the presidency, but because It's a publicly owned utility state where every little municipality owns their own utility, and you change a few board members on a little local board and you can shut down a coal-fired power plant. All right, those are the criteria we've used for these 19 states. Those are also the criteria we are using to determine whether we will expand into additional states. We may expand Charlotte. If we do, we're going to be announcing it probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And it's not going to be an enormous expansion. It'll probably be 1 or 2 states and only 1 or 2 states.
Great. Wendy had a question, and I'm sure many more people are thinking, why the heck aren't these environmentalists voting? Haven't they learned?
Oh man, yes, Wendy. Yes. Why the hell aren't these environmentalists voting? Okay. Uh, Very quickly, there are a few things we know and a few things we don't know. Uh, what we don't know is, well, let me put this a different way. We can't just trust what people say. There's something in polling science uh, called social desirability bias, where if you ask people why they aren't doing something, they will typically give you what they think is the most palatable excuse for not having done that thing. And we know that when you poll people about voting, they lie their pants off. And they swear that they vote, even when public voter files show that they haven't. And they often give excuses that aren't truthful excuses for not voting. So it's not as simple as just asking environmentalists, hey, why aren't you voting? I wish it were that easy, Wendy. But here are 2 things we do know about why environmentalists aren't voting. First, people who list climate and other environmental issues as their top priority are disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, and slightly disproportionately lower income. What do those 3 demographic groups have in common? Young people, people of color, and lower income people? They all vote less often. So part of what's going on here is a mere demographic correlation, although, to be clear, there's also something a bit more sinister here. Those are also the 3 demographic groups that are always the target of voter suppression efforts. Many people in the climate and environmental space don't often think of ballot access and voter suppression as being an issue that impacts us, but it absolutely does. If any government entity anywhere is trying to keep someone from voting, chances are they are targeting young people, people of color, or lower income people. And that right there is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. The second thing that we know about why environmentalists likely aren't voting is that, when I say this, it rubs people the wrong way sometimes, but I'm afraid it's true. The climate movement is weirdly apolitical. For decades, most Americans have thought of environmental activism and climate activism as being a purely personal set of actions that have to do with their personal behavior. You ask a random person on the street, do you care about the climate crisis? Oh, okay, well, what do you do about it? Chances are they're going to say they change how they eat, or they change how they get to work, or they change the electricity they consume, all of which are important, but they are weirdly apolitical, right? I mean, you would never hear someone who's concerned about healthcare talk that way, or reproductive rights, or gun violence. Would you hear someone who cares about gun violence not even mention politics and instead just say, well, I'm going to solve this by changing my own personal behavior? No way. But that's how the climate movement thinks. And it's largely because of a very sophisticated PR campaign from the fossil fuel industry. They've spent decades and billions of dollars trying to convince us that this is all our fault because of our plastic water bottles instead of their fault with their coal-fired power plants. And we bought it hook, line, and sinker. And that means we don't think of the climate crisis as a systemic political problem that requires systemic political change. But it is, and it does. All right. I realize we're at the limit. Do we want to try one really, really quick question, or should we end it there?
I was able to get to all of them in the chat. So the last
Outstanding.
question we've had a few times is, oh my gosh, there was so much information. So would you just remind folks where they can get this after we close the Zoom?
Absolutely. You can go to environmentalvoter.org. You can go there to sign up to volunteer. You can go there to donate, become a monthly donor. You can also click on some of the links in the chat. In fact, I encourage you to, because we all know what happens at the end of these Zoom webinars, right? Like everything closes and you're like, oh, where did that link go? Well, we'll go in there now and click on the link. And I'll just close by saying, please accept this invitation to get involved in our work. Believe me, I know you're tired. I know we don't want to be in this situation that we're in right now. We want to take a break from campaigning. We want to take a break from being scared or worried. I get it. But we also know what's on the line. And you're here for a reason. You're here because you want to make an impact. And what I'm telling you is that we have proven results and we have opportunities for you to make that impact. So please join us, become a monthly donor, volunteer for one of these phone banks. We would love to get you involved in postcarding or calling or canvassing so that 2 years from now and 4 years from now, we are looking at real political power in the climate movement. All right. Thank you, everybody. I can't wait to see you on the doors or the phones. Have a good night.